I'd now like to introduce today's session on how to assess subjective student outcomes using both quantitative and qualitative data. Determining which subjective outcomes to assess, as well as tips for making credible, valid assertions will be covered, and case studies will be introduced so we can practice, practice using the concepts. So I am now going to hand it over to today's presenter, Jackie Thomas, the Assistant Director of Assessment and Academic Success for Residential Life in the Division of Student Affairs. Using your applause icons, let's welcome Jackie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the welcome. Thank you so much, Katie, for all your help and support in getting me ready for this presentation. Is everyone able to see my slides? I see some thumbs up. Thank you so much. All right. Well, again, I'm Jackie Thomas, and we are going to talk about and practice, most importantly, methods of assessing subjective student outcomes. Most people are familiar with the concept of student learning outcomes, and they know that they're important, but there are a lot of nuances associated with, there are a lot of nuances associated with assessing student outcomes as well. And today we're basically just going to talk about assessing it and this particular type of outcome so that we can do a good job with it. So in order to do that, we are going to answer these questions and discuss these topics on our agenda. First, we are going to go over what is relevant from some of the assessment basics, like what student outcomes are, why student outcomes are measured, and what the difference is between the objective and subjective assessment and outcomes. Then we're going to discuss in more detail why subjective outcomes are especially relevant right now and how to assess subjective student outcomes quantitatively and qualitatively. After that, we will look at some examples, and then we're going to do some case studies together. So a few reminders and housekeeping things. This is going to be a hands-on session. If you remember my session from, I want to say July of this year, it was very hands-on, and this will be hands-on as well. I am going to share some different situations where subjective student outcomes need to be assessed. And then I'm going to ask you for solutions. So I have some thoughts on some of the material, but I don't have all of the answers. And I think that typically in higher ed, we do our best work when we do things together. So, and I also recommend that whenever you are doing assessment, if you can do it with a team and not alone, that also makes your assessment stronger. So building those assessment teamwork skills today. And then second, we'll pause occasionally for questions, but feel free to enter questions into the chat. And actually, let me get the chat up so that I am able to see them. Okay. So there's always been an interest in how the various aspects of the college experience has affected students. This has looked like oral recitations and weekly disputes or debates that faculty encourage students to participate in as early as the 11th century. But the current style of assessing the college student experience is credited to Aston's work that he started publishing in the 70s and refined, excuse me, has refined since then, but I think a lot of what we use from Aston today was published in the 90s. What you see on this slide is his IEO model. So that's inputs. Those are the things that students come to college with, as well as the things that colleges make available to students. and the environment, which is the college experience, and then the outputs, right? That's the value added. And that's really what a lot of higher ed assessment is right now. It involves determining the value that students are getting from the college experience, and more we're using research methods. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So when you go about assessing outcomes, I have some general assessment reminders, best practices reminders. When you go about assessing student outcomes, you first want to figure out why it is that you are measuring these student outcomes. You want to keep in mind that assessment should always have a purpose. And I say this in every presentation that I do. It's not okay to collect data for the sake of curiosity. And it is unethical to collect data and not use it to improve the experience of the individuals who stop to give you the data. It is very common for a lot of us on college campuses to want to assess how we're doing in terms of whatever the salient topic is at the time. And right now, the words that we're hearing a lot probably are engagement, belonging, diversity, inclusion. And you want to keep in mind that most outcomes associated with these salient topics are subjective, and assessing them can be tricky. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But just make sure that, as always, you have a purpose associated with your assessment and that you use it in order to improve your practices. So we are going to start by getting clear on the difference between subjective and objective assessment and outcomes. Objective student outcomes are the things that you and other people can observe students doing and arrive at the same conclusion every time. Objective assessment inquiries typically answer questions like, are students using my office's program or service? Are students matriculating, or are they learning, right? And these types of questions can be answered using more objective evidence, often quantitative data. And examples of that are the number of appointments students had with an advisor. That's not something that can be refuted, right? The number of students who complete their degree programs on time or matriculate from their second year to their third year, which is often when stop out happens, we know. We can look at the number of students who need some type of intervention, such as support from our Title IX office, or roommate mediations in residential life, or maybe students need to work with a case manager or a mental health counselor because they've been impacted by some type of racism or discrimination on campus. We also can look at the number of events that an office makes available to a student. We can look at how often students attend classes, wait times in order to get to their appointments or have a chance to talk to like their financial aid counselor, the number of emails that we send out to students from our individual departments. And we can do like a training and see how many students can correctly identify the definition of something like diversity or engagement. So all of these things give you irrefutable evidence of what students are experiencing and achieving. Now, when you look at subjective outcomes, these are the phenomena that multiple people could observe and potentially arrive at different conclusions. And when you're doing subjective assessment, you are trying to answer questions like, have we helped students develop leadership skills, or have we helped them develop life skills? Are students engaged? Do they feel like they belong? or have we helped them develop an appreciation for diversity? So those are those big questions. And objective evidence or quantitative data or metrics can sometimes be used to help us answer some of these questions, but often you need to collect a different kind of data that takes sometimes a little bit longer to get. It can be there can be a few more steps in analyzing it. And frankly, it's usually less conclusive than we met our goal of having 500 students visit our office, right? And then there are also some important considerations you want to make before you report your subjective student outcome data. So that begs the question that if data on the objective outcomes are considered irrefutable evidence and data on subjective outcomes can be a little more complicated and a lot less definitive, why does anybody bother assessing subjective outcomes? And I want to give our participants a chance. Feel free to unmute or type it in the box. Why do you think we even bother if we could potentially get other evidence that is very conclusive and direct?
Well, I'll jump in because I have a feeling that this session was scheduled because I requested it. My program goal is to increase student sense of belonging.
Oops, I'm sorry.
So we have to measure that because that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yep, absolutely.
I think another reason why it's important to understand subjective data is so we can get a little bit more deeper, significant information from the respondent. Sometimes subjective data can be limiting to just a specific behavior or idea that's created by the researcher. And this can allow us to get new data that we may not have considered.
Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing in the chat, let me make sure I don't miss. Oh, wonderful. So in the chat, I see we want to see feelings, how people are feeling. In the performing arts, there are many ways to approach the same issue and demonstrate application of skills. That's absolutely true, I'm sure, for the performing arts, but also a lot of places as well. Maybe asking people, no matter what they say, we have a chance to engage with them. By asking people, by asking people, we have a chance to engage with them. I think about that a lot, and that is actually one way that I am able, I feel, to help my department with certain things is by having the assessment remind them that, hey, my department does all of these things. Are you interacting with them? And I think sometimes just the wording of my questions and the structure of my assessments really do help remind students that, you know, my department has all of these things available and that we're really trying to help them. And then, you know, when you ask questions about like, what's your experience been like? They have in mind like, oh, you all do all of these things, right? So I really like that, Roseanne. Disparate impact on different groups, absolutely. Absolutely. Because subjective outcomes support objective successes. Yep, we measure what's important. We're going to talk about that some more today too. Some of the critical thinking skills we're cultivating can also lead to different conclusions or develop new methods of collecting data or analyzing it. Yes, I think there's a lot of movement right now on just how to do assessment for higher education institutions, whether it's student affairs or academic affairs. And there are entire conferences just on like how we're doing assessment and sharing how we know what we know, and how we're doing and how we're defining success and all of those things. Support our students' mental health, absolutely. Go deeper and find new insights. Yeah, so thank you all so much. The things that I would add to that is that when you are looking at subjective outcomes, you are able to acknowledge things that are multi-layered and complex. And I think a lot of the comments that you added definitely point to that. And there are a lot of reasons you can't just ask a student like, hey, are you engaged with our campus community? And use that as your only data point. Oftentimes the way that we look at engagement in my department may be different from how another department looks at engagement. And also students don't understand those types of terms. So you often have to really break down what you're wanting to have students achieve or do or learn. And I think a lot of our comments also alluded to the fact that subjective outcomes assessment allows you to tell a fuller story. So when you're counting things or testing students for factual information, you're never going to figure out what their perceptions are, what they value, if their emotional maturity has increased as a result of participating in your program. And then finally, we're going to talk much more about this a little bit later, but most of our leadership has signed us up to do this type of assessment, right? All of our mission statements for our departments, for our institutions, for our divisions, use terminology like student success and belonging and inclusion and engagement. And in Res Life, like we hear a lot about things like, are you able to balance your needs with the needs of the community that you live in? So those are the types of things that I think about when I think about why we spend so much time trying to figure out how we're doing with these more subjective student outcomes that we're hoping to affect. Okay. So let's talk about why these outcomes are especially relevant right now. And I would say it's for these two reasons. First, higher education assessment is more and more successful at using research methods and showcasing the value of the holistic college experience that we're providing, which means that we're getting really good at demonstrating how our work impacts students. We're getting good at understanding the experiences of students who have been maybe historically overlooked or poorly served by our institutions. And we're getting good at making data-driven decisions so that we can continuously improve. So that's great, right? And then second, our improved assessment efforts happen to loosely at the same time be coinciding with the fact that a lot of campuses are adopting the business model. And these two things together have created some really good opportunities as well as some serious challenges. Excuse me. So in terms of the challenges, I just want to acknowledge that sometimes assessment is avoided by people because they feel like it's going to be used to contribute to this culture of like justifying your jobs and justifying your programs and the services that are near and dear to our hearts that we know are creating a good student experience. And that culture of assessment can be real demoralizing and counterproductive because I believe, like someone said in the comments, that, yes, I'll explain the business model in just a second. Actually, I'll stop and do that. So when I say that a lot of campuses are adopting the business model, there has been this shift on the parts of a lot of parties. So not just the institutions, not just students, not just staff and administration, but there's been this, I would say like entire campus community like shift at kind of commodifying higher education. So come to this school and you'll get a good job, right? As opposed to the things that we know students come to college for that we don't necessarily spend time on. So for instance, when you attend a four-year university, or when you attend a university to get a four-year degree, you're usually involving yourself in something called liberal arts education. If you are getting a liberal arts education, you should be leaving college with citizenship skills and like other soft skills, right? You should leave college being able to communicate at a certain level and have all of these other outcomes that we see in student development theory that we all agree are amazing. But sometimes when we are looking at the business model, we're just trying to figure out how many students are making it through college in a certain amount of time. It can cause us to alienate students. It can cause us to have students look at us as just service providers as opposed to individuals on a campus who are here to teach them. And I would say that student affairs professionals have just as much of a responsibility to teach students as do our faculty. Does that answer that question? Yes, okay. So when you have the business model, when you're adopting the business model and you are adopting this culture of like, let's just figure out, how to spend like as little money on these things so that we can do like whatever, right? Like you can really create a culture where people feel like I need to do assessment in order to justify my job. I need to do assessment in order to justify the existence of this program or service. And I would say that if that is the only thing you're doing with assessment, you're going about it the wrong way. So it's important to make really clear what it is that you are doing with your assessment. And that's why I say it's important to use the assessment and report back how you're doing it. But you can inadvertently narrow the scope of people's work. And I think earlier when I was reading the comments that someone said like, whatever gets assessed gets the attention, right? And that's absolutely true. And ultimately, if we are, if we have our staff just trying to meet with a bunch of students and not worry about the quality of those meetings or the outcomes of those meetings or what students are learning from those meetings, or we have staff that just want students to come to programs, but we're not worried about student learning at the programs or what students could be getting out of the programs, then ultimately the students lose out. Most people don't get into higher education to just like do the business model, like have students come to their programs and not actually be putting energy into making quality programs, et cetera, et cetera. So the staff become unhappy, et cetera, et cetera. Cool. So I make this point about the business model only to say that it's important that assessment is done well, because when it is done well, there are a lot of positive things that you can do. You can use the data to help you fairly and effectively allocate resources. And typically when people have good data, they are able to share it and they're able to be more transparent. So if my program gets cut because another program needs resources and someone shows me the data, I might understand why I have less because people were transparent with me. As opposed to, I just think it's unfair. Or maybe it's something I did wrong and I'm internalizing that and then I'm sad at my job. You can use data to address problems and make improvements. And I know I said so many positive things and that often does not feel positive, but that is a positive thing in the long run, even if there's some growing pains. And then you can celebrate the positive ways that your area is contributing to students' learning and development, and you can recognize the efforts of both the people and the programs that are helping you make a positive impact on students. Any questions before we move into how to assess subjective student outcomes? Okay. All right. So when you are assessing subjective student outcomes specifically, there are a few things that you need to do to make sure that your assessment is accurate. First, you want to define everything. You want to clearly define the subjective outcome, and I would recommend you start by brainstorming what things are indicators of success and non-success. Indicators are basically statements that explain what it would look like if you met your goal. I would also recommend that you take the time to figure out what it would look like if you didn't meet your goal or if you halfway met your goal, and try to operationalize that a little bit on the non-success side a little bit more, because sometimes we set a goal for ourselves and we make really good progress, and we are not able to celebrate that progress because we didn't think about what maybe partially meeting our goal looks like. But again, indicators are statements that explain what it's going to look like if you meet your goal, and they are quantifiable and measurable. From there, once you have brainstormed about how you're going to define the subjective outcome and what your indicators are going to be, you want to list all of the things that your area does that contributes to that outcome. And then from there, you want to take a moment to consider how the definitions you're creating align with the larger departmental, divisional, institutional goals. And this can help you ensure that you're on the right track, and it can give you some direction as you are settling on definition and indicators. So that's the process of just getting things defined. You want to make sure that the subjective outcome is very clearly defined, and you want to identify some indicators so you would know what it will look like when you're successful and how you can quantify and measure that. And then
a little bit more about how to create quantifiable subjective outcomes.
Yes, and we're gonna both talk about it and do some of it together a little bit later, but I typically look to make things SMART goals. So you wanna make things specific, measurable, attainable, I always forget the R, and timely. I forget what R is. I don't know if somebody can put that in the chat. So realistic, relevant. Thanks. So I'm gonna keep going, and we are going to do that together. So if you can just hold on a moment, let me get through, I think it's just 2 more slides.
Of course, thank you.
Cool. All right, so after you have all of the things defined, you are going to start the planning. And this is really important. You want to determine what data you need to assess the subjective outcome. You want to look for data that you already have or can get from places like databases, your website and social media analytics, assessments you already do, et cetera, et cetera. You want to basically collect whatever will help you understand how you're doing on that subjective outcome, and then determine what specific things students can do where they demonstrate where they are with that outcome. So I would say that the things that we would typically look at are going to be a specific action that you observe, a specific action that students report to you, or a statement that students can agree with about their feelings, beliefs, or perceptions. So I'm going to give examples of those three things because these really help with the planning of how you're going to operationalize and collect data on your subjective student outcome. So when you're looking at a specific action that you can observe, let's say, for instance, you are an advisor of a student club and you're assessing their teamwork skills. You might do an activity where they practice how to step up to give their ideas, how to step back to let others give their ideas, and then work together to combine their ideas or pick the best idea or whatever to move the project forward. And then after that, you've done your activity with them, so you had your intervention, then you attend some of their meetings to observe how well they work as a team. And you could also do things like keep track of how many conflicts come up throughout that year as a result of, or maybe not as a result of, how many conflicts happen that year that emanate from lack of teamwork and teamwork skills, and the intensity of that conflict, right? Maybe it takes less time to resolve conflicts amongst this club because you establish some common language at the beginning of the year. All right. In terms of an action that students report to you, let's say you work in an academic support office and your office has emailed out tips to build effective study habits. And they have posters everywhere and you're just doing this big education campaign on what it takes to effectively study at UC Berkeley. So later on in the year, you might ask students in a survey if they've read the emails and the posters and seen the campaign, and then whether they've used the study tips. And then in terms of a statement that students can agree with about their feelings, beliefs, or perceptions, this is the one that we typically do in surveys, but we can also do it in focus groups and interviews with students. So for instance, if you are working in an international, let's say you're working with an international student office and you're getting students to be engaged, you may ask students in a survey if they feel welcomed on campus. And you may also ask the campus as they are sending out a survey to ask if students in general feel welcomed on campus, and then ask them to pull your data specifically for your students so that you can compare how your international students are doing to some of the domestic students. Okay, so those are examples, and we're going to get much more into that soon. So we've defined our outcome, and we've defined the indicators for the outcome. We have a plan on exactly how we're going to get the data to show how we're doing on the outcome or gauge how we're doing on the outcome. And next, we're ready to collect all the data sources. So what I recommend is collect all your data and gather it all. And then I recommend analyzing your individual pieces, but then taking a step back to review it all together and understand the story and ask yourself which data points agree with each other, which ones contradict, so that you can effectively tell the story. We'll come back to reporting a little, actually no, we'll talk about reporting now. Because reporting is the last thing. So finally, you want to make sure that you package your report so that the definitions and indicators are clear. And I say that because you're probably going to need to add much more description in a report where you're reporting on subjective student outcomes as opposed to a report where you are reporting on objective assessment projects. So be ready to explain, like, this is how we have defined engagement. These are the things that we are looking for students to be able to do if they feel included in the campus community, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And then lots of tips and considerations as you move forward. So first, it may be helpful if you share the subjective outcomes definitions with students, either before you provide the experience or during the experience. This way, when they see the language on the survey or hear it in an interview, it isn't their first time seeing it or hearing it. And this would make me more confident in my data, but I recommend this. I recommend this knowing that there are some times where it's not practical or even appropriate to explain certain things to students. Like sometimes it's just not worth stopping them. But oftentimes, if your office is committed to providing a certain level of service or committed to providing a welcoming environment or things like that, those are often things that you're okay with telling people. So it's okay to tell students, this is what you can expect. And then later on down the line, when you ask them, like, did you get it? They won't be surprised that you were trying to provide that all along. Next, you want to use multiple data sources. So you can meaningfully connect quantitative data and qualitative data to tell a fuller story. And I highly recommend that. This establishes a lot more certainty with your results, and research methods, courses and textbooks, they call this triangulation. Another word from research methods, courses, and textbooks is member checking. So this is basically when you ask your participants, after you have interpreted, like analyzed and interpreted your data, you ask your participants, is this correct, right? Is this a good interpretation of, or do we understand your experience? Do we understand what you've learned? So those are good things to do. I'll come back to that other point. When you're building assessment tools, those are likely to be surveys or interview protocols. You want to look for sample survey and interview questions. I will very often just Google things. We are also a campus labs campus. I don't know if the academic affairs side of the house has it, but student affairs, we all have campus labs. And in campus labs, there are all of these surveys that other campuses have included into this database. And you can go in and look at their surveys, and it's really helpful. You can ask your colleagues or your networks for ways that they have operationalized and collected data on certain things. And you can also ask your area. I have been in my position for a year, so sometimes I don't always know like the history of what's happened in the department. So sometimes it's helpful to ask individuals in your area if there are any surveys or interviews that were done in the past that you can dust off and make use of. So I say all of that to say, if you don't have to recreate the wheel, don't. Modify something else if you can, but also be aware that you don't have to just, take a survey that someone else did and not make any changes to it. You really want to make sure that you are getting the data that you need for the project that you're working on. So feel free to modify, even if you get that survey that someone else used and they're super reputable, make sure that it works for you. So you also want to be really, really careful to word your surveys and your interview questions so that students understand them. You want to avoid jargon. One good piece of advice I got on just communicating in general is you have to basically, certain things you have to communicate in a way where you cannot be misunderstood. And I think that's a good way to look at subjective student outcome questions when you're asking students, because they are not savvy to some of the nuances, to the jargon that we use, right? To the engagement, to the belonging and things like that. So you have to ask yourself for every question that you ask them, is there a way that they could misinterpret what I mean? That will save you a lot of time and heartache later on. We'll talk about heartache later on in a minute. And then you want to consider doing a pre-post survey or pre-post observation, pre-post interviews with students to figure out what their baseline was and how they've grown. And when you can, pilot your assessments that you build or modify. I was listening to some like conference presentation about assessment, and the gentleman basically said, like, a lot of the times in student affairs and other places in higher ed, we have really amazing access to students, and it's really worth our time to ask like a small group of students if they can take a survey and give us feedback on anything that didn't make sense before we send it out to 30,000 students. So keep that in mind. Next, you want to bite off chunks and do what makes sense. You may decide on 5 indicators, but only assess 1 or 2 a year because that's your bandwidth. You may also decide that 4 types of data would be ideal to have. Maybe you want the metric data, the survey, the focus group, and you want to do some really deep document analysis of, you know, students' contracts and how we've advertised certain experiences to them. But you may only have the bandwidth to do 2 of those in the year, and you'll just have to make some judgment calls on which 2 are most important. Just do what makes sense and get help from other people if you can. Know that this is an iterative process. When I was talking about heartache a little bit earlier, when you're doing assessment, you're gonna overlook a detail that would have resulted in an important change. You're gonna forget to add something that you really wanted to put in there. You're gonna word something wrong and question your data, or word something wrong and your data may not be as useful as you hoped it would be. Just take notes on what can be improved next time and try to forgive yourself. Keep in mind that qualitative data, including open-ended survey questions, can take a while to analyze. Be sure to only collect what you have time. And I would say also expertise, but it's hard to know what you don't know. Be sure to collect like what you have the time and expertise to analyze and use. And if you're not sure about qualitative data, analysis and reporting, like there's lots of resources out there. And then there are also awesome people on campus, like in CAN, who can consult with you. And remember also, it is unethical to collect open-ended responses and just like mine them and hunt for quotes that you want to use for your reports and website. So actually do analyze that data and use it to help the students. And then finally, reporting nuances. So be careful not to claim causation, especially when it's not appropriate. And again, this is one of those things where it's hard to know what you don't know. So reporting might be a great place to consult with others if you haven't done this type of reporting, assessment and reporting before. Typically, students have multiple opportunities to work on a skill, refine their views, or feel connected, welcomed, engaged with the campus, right? So when you report, you have to be sure you make room for the possibility that the student benefited from the other interactions, right? The informal interactions they have with students, the formal interactions they have with staff, faculty, the classes and programs they've been a part of. Like usually when we're looking at subjective assessment, subjective student outcomes, we are not the only provider and service and program on the campus that is helping students with that area. And then of course, don't just report the data that makes you look good. Report all the data that you have. So we're about to get into case studies, but I wanted to offer these resources. This is a graphic on SMART goals. Realistic, relevant. Yeah, they're both really important, right? But this is a graphic on SMART goals. So you can do that in a nutshell. On the right, the graphic is Bloom's taxonomy. That can be really helpful. I like Bloom's taxonomy for some things, not for everything. I always say that alignment is super important. So UC Berkeley's strategic plan is there. And then there's this student development theory cheat sheet that I like to use a lot when I am doing things. So I don't think you can just click on the screen and get to that, but oh no, everyone has access to the slides. Okay, cool. So this is a good time for a question break before we move into examples and then case studies. Is there anything?
I was just ready to say the same. The link for the cheat sheet is not live.
Okay. Let's see if I can find it really quickly. Oh, that didn't work at all. Oh, okay, give me 1 second. I'm just gonna give it to you now. Cheat sheet, and it is this one. This is actually much nicer than the one that I usually use. All right. Cool. Can everyone see that? This is from Wichita State, Wichita University. All right. Okay. We're gonna move forward because typically around 11 o'clock, people need to go. So let's get some of these examples and case studies in. So these are, I have 2 examples from the University of Kansas's impact report. And this first example is from the student programs office. And this is what they reported in terms of their assessment on students' leadership development. So what you'll see here, I highlighted in yellow what they were doing in the middle. I don't think I have a pointer on here. What they were doing in the middle. So they're using qualitative and quantitative methods to assess the learning resulting from student leaders' participation in the training workshops. And they give us these data points. 95% of students agreed that they reflected on their own identities and how it impacts their leadership and so on. And those are great numbers also. Everybody wants to have a report like that, right? And then they have this really awesome quote on the side, which gives information above and beyond. Like, not only does this quote support the quantitative data you have there, it actually really paints a picture of what students could be, what each of the leaders could be getting out of their experience with working with this office. So the student said, I've gained indispensable leadership experience. And at the bottom, they talk about how they have a community of people that they consider to be family. I love this report. We'll move to the next one. Okay. So this is a very multifaceted report from their housing office or housing and residential life area. But housing and residential life, I know from experience, is a very multifaceted operation. So they have a whole lot of information here, right? They don't have just one program that they were able to kind of triangulate by using multiple sources. They had a lot that they needed to say, and they had to do it quickly because they don't give us a lot of words on these impact reports. So the first part is the first report here gives a narration of how their new student leadership structure decreased competitiveness and increased engagement. So I just highlighted this last sentence that said, with these changes, program boards and AURH were more complementary than competitive, and all student groups experienced an increase in resident engagement. But I had questions, right? They didn't provide any other information other than their observation. I want to know how many more residents attended their programs this year than last year. I want to know if their student leaders that were creating these experiences for the residents had a better learning experience as they learned how to be leaders. I want to know if they collaborated more. Did they collaborate on like 10 more programs this year than they did last year? What happened, right? So there's a lot of information that could have been given. However, I understand because they had to give 3 reports in this on this one page. The second report, which is under the area that says by the numbers, what jumped out at me here is that this report tells us how many first-year residents returned over the last 2 academic years. And this is always an important question for housing, right? We want the students to have a good experience. We want them to come back. But what caused this change, right? There's been an increase. Are the students more satisfied with their experience? If so, what part of their experience? Are students feeling safer on campus? Did they implement some other assessment data and make some changes and improvements, and the students are happier? What happened? And then this third report, the residential curriculum assessment, says, I'm gonna finish this part. The third report assesses their residential curriculum, and because I'm looking for subjective student outcomes, like this was my favorite part, right? But I also am wondering what other data we think could have made this section stronger. And I want to invite you to put that in the chat. So we're looking at the residential curriculum assessment, and the goal that they stated is to gain an understanding of the learning that takes place for their first-year students. And they have some numbers here about what students were able to achieve. So what other data could they have provided if they had more space to make this section a little bit stronger?
I just put this in the chat, but one thing that caught my eye is whether or not those are pre and post implemented to measure if there was any change in how they can explain their social identities, or that can be really useful in just understanding what the baseline was. And then this other point about, it's great to hear that they were able to describe strategies for their academic success, but it's another thing to clarify what were success strategies.
Yep. What did you do to help create this, create these outcomes for students? And how did you get this data, right? I don't know, I don't remember if it said if this was like a survey or what, but how many students participated? What is the baseline? What's acceptable? Anything else? What could have made this area stronger? And just FYI, after this is all case studies that we're going to be doing together. Okay, we're going to move on. But I think that, thank you, Larry. A lot of the questions that I had were also the things that you brought up. I also would want to know what the goal was, right? Is that 85% something to be concerned about? Or is it something to be celebrated? Maybe they could have brought some quotes in, and again, told us how many programs they did that address these different outcomes that they were showcasing here. All right, everybody, find your chat box or your unmute button, because we are going to do some case studies. So I pulled mission statements from various departments at other various colleges, and what I'm wanting us to do is to work together to answer these questions. Some of these things I've looked at and I have some thoughts on. Some of these things I've looked at and I don't really know. So again, I believe we're stronger together as a team. So I'm hoping we can work as a team and figure some of these things out. So the questions that we want to ask ourselves are, what subjective student outcomes are basically promised in these mission statements? And then from there, what indicators could the department use to assess how they're doing with those different outcomes? And then from there, what evidence can we collect? And basically, what questions can we ask? So the first one is from San Francisco State University's new, thank you, Katie. From San Francisco State University's new student orientation department. So this is the department that once students are accepted and they send their statement of intent to register, they start getting the students ready and oriented to the campus and ready to just succeed and have a good experience and integrate into and transition into the community. So I highlighted two things here. First, they are looking to help students successfully transition to college life. And then they're also looking to promote open discussions about the expectations and perceptions around the campus community. So, what are those student subjective student outcomes, and what indicators could we use for them?
Well, I know that when I was being coached on doing outcome-based assessment, I was told, you should set your outcome and then ask if you achieve that outcome. So it seems like a very general outcome. So you'd be asking students, did we help you have a successful transition to college life, which is a pretty broad outcome.
Yes. Very broad.
There are things that you could measure about the successful transition to college life. I mean, like how well students do, at various points during the first classes that they take in college. And then this part about open discussion, whether you have discussion forums and then how students feel about those discussion forums. But I agree, and especially the mission statement, which you haven't gotten to, is extremely vague and hard to pin anything specific on it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But a lot of our mission statements look like this, right? And then you get a assessment professional that comes in and we're like, okay, what exactly, like how exactly can I help you? And you start trying to nail things down. I saw a raised hand. Is it
Hi, this is Francesca. I'm the one who raised, I wasn't sure if we were supposed to raise hands in the participant thing or not. So a couple of things. One is the Career Center has two kind of things that they want to measure. One is their own ability to prepare, right? Like what kinds of things do they have in place that they believe are preparatory to somebody else? And then on the back end, it's like, what proof do they have that students feel prepared, are prepared? And I think that's always one of the big challenges with the mission statement and going to student assessment within a class situation. There's a parallel with us. Sometimes educators ignore they confuse the goals of the class with the learning outcomes, right? So I always used to coach, and I currently coach the instructors in FPF to say, your goal is why you put this class together in the first place. I'd like to present this kind of stuff. And then the learning outcome is what you believe students should be able to do after 15 weeks with you, right? And once I do that, I find even the verbs they use shift, right? Because they start imagining the students after 15 weeks. But just from my own teaching, I used to teach a class called Music Appreciation. And so it drove our assessment folks at USF crazy. How do you assess appreciating? And I was like, I don't know, it's the name of the class that was set by the Academic Senate. So I found that the learning outcomes, even though I joked everybody was learning outcomes loco, it became really helpful, because if I could imagine what I wanted a student to do after 15 weeks with me that they couldn't do before they met me, it opened up all this stuff. What kinds of assignments I had, which ones were subjective, how I told students I'd be assessing them, etc. So sorry, that was a lot, I know, but like your presentation has brought up so many great things. So that's where I'm at.
I really like the idea of doing the exercise where you imagine what students can do after they have spent 15 weeks with you in a class, or for instance, this new student orientation department might want to imagine what students can do after they have gone through the formal orientation, as well as received whatever follow-up supports that the orientation department provides. And then a career center, right? Like usually getting students towards the end of their academic careers, but what can they do after they maybe meet with the career center one time, visit the career center multiple times, right? I love that. I love that idea of using that as an exercise, and we can do that today. So,
and one other thing I want to add is going back to my original point about that the Career Center kind of wants to measure two different things that are subjective, right? Their own ability as staff members and professionals to provide this, as well as their proof that students were prepared because of what they provided, as opposed to just 4 years in college or whatever. What it also kind of helps shape like job tasks and like where staff members put their energy to, you're right, in resources on the front end. So somebody in chat wrote that mission statements sometimes can be broad, and it might be really useful to be that broad. But I think what happens is, and I keep resonating with something you said earlier, which is, never collect data from someone that you don't have an intention to use. So many offices will have surveys that have like 18 questions, but they really only want to know the answer to 2 of them. And I'm always telling like my director, like, please, why don't we cut half of these? We're not going to use them, right? And so we're all used to making these broad mission statements or these grand intentions that we actually can't measure at all, which is different from the myth of whether subjective assessment is useful, fruitful, or good for embedding in academia.
So I actually thank you so much, Francesca, for all of that. I want to stick with the preparing students for what they want to do from UC Santa Barbara's Career Center really quickly. When I saw that, I was like, that's great. If I'm a student, I definitely want my Career Center to do exactly that. I want you to prepare me for what I want to do and develop my career skills, right? I'm very happy with that as a student, but typically students don't know exactly what they want to do. So there's a lot of steps involved to even getting to the point where you can prepare students for what they want to do, because oftentimes career centers have to help students figure out what that is. I see Larry's thumbs up. So typically we have to figure out what it is that students want to do. And there's a whole body of work about just how to do that, right? Then you get to the preparation steps. And yeah, there are different things you need to look at in terms of being prepared, right? Like staff need to be able to do certain things. Students need to experience certain things and then be able to do certain things. So I agree with that. Unless there are other thoughts on that in particular, the preparing students for what they want to do, I want to go back to the successful transition to college life. Okay, so when you look at a statement like successful transition to college life, you all hit the nail on the head right away. This is a lot to assess because you have to figure out how to support students holistically, since the types of transitions that you're trying to help them with aren't being specified. And this is where, assessment professionals, we have to start getting like really creative and start trying to nail down things. And this is where people give the resistance, and some of you probably know what I mean. It's fine. But in terms of indicators, I was thinking, these are just my thoughts. I would want to know how many students complete the fall semester and return for spring, right? That indicates a successful transition if you finish and come back, because we need you to do that at least 8 times if you're on the semester system. How many students stay in their housing contracts? If you transition well, you are probably able to get along with others and be part of a community. If you don't transition well, maybe not. But I say those two things, both the how many students come back for spring as well as how many stay in their housing contracts, knowing that just because a student stops out or just because a student cancels their housing contract, that doesn't necessarily indicate that their transition was not successful. There are other factors that could have affected their needs and decisions and ability to continue, right? So you really have to make sure that you tell a story that is sensitive to the human condition, which is not everybody does the same thing. I would also want to ask students in maybe a survey or focus group or some other way. I would want to ask them if they felt welcomed and belonging, if they have friends. That is huge for young people, right? You come to college, you may or may not know anybody. You might have brought people from high school with you, but in general, you definitely want to create new friends. So that's huge. And then students report that the campus has resources that will help them care for their health and wellness. So that hits like a little bit of all the areas. And so those are my ideas of indicators. But do you see how broad that is and how specific we have to make it so that we can assess it? And are there any thoughts or other things that we could potentially look at if we're trying to figure out successful transition to college life? Okay, let me make sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. We have just a couple. I don't think I missed any. All right.
Maybe I could bring back my question from earlier in terms, because you said one of the things you would want to look at is, do the students feel welcome?
Mm-hmm.
other than asking, do you feel welcome? Do you feel like do you feel like that's the effective way to do it? Are there other sort of more indirect ways to do it?
That's a great question. And that is in part what you can do during your defining exercise and planning exercise. So yes, there are times when students will know exactly what you're talking about. It's perfectly acceptable to ask students if they're welcome, if they feel welcomed on the campus, because most people know what that experience feels like. Maybe not as great of an idea to ask students if they feel belongingness, right? Or engagement. They may not understand what that means. And in either case, where the students are going to have a really clear understanding of what you mean, or maybe a little more murky understanding of what you mean, it is always a good idea to ask other questions, right? So if you tell me that you feel like you are welcomed on this campus, tell me the things that make you feel welcomed, right? Because then you're telling me the things that I can do more of. And then maybe there are other indicators of welcomeness, right? Maybe do you feel comfortable talking to staff? Do you feel comfortable talking to other students you don't know? There are other things that you can ask if the sense of being welcomed is really what you're trying to hone in on as a subjective student outcome. Does that help?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
That was an excellent question. Thank you. And then I also want to just acknowledge that example in particular. I am very lucky to have inherited an amazing data set for an amazing survey that my department has been sending out the last couple of years. My predecessor, Janelle Padilla, who is here, so excited to see you, actually did work with the department to create this survey where we asked students, did you feel welcomed? And then they worked to imagine all of the things that residential life could have done to make students feel welcomed and listed those. And we actually have that data on what contributed to students' ability to feel welcomed. And of course, it was the other students that were nice to them, right? It was not as much like, for the undergraduate students at least, it was not as much like we gave you really clear information on how to, use our services. They didn't care so much about that. They wanted to talk to the other students. They wanted to connect with their RA and things of that nature. But we know it's going to be really important for students on move-in day and just beyond that time. So thanks, Janelle. All right, we're gonna move on to another one. So there are two on this slide as well. This is UC Riverside's Academic Resource Center. This place is awesome. If you do any type of academic support work, you should definitely look them up. They're doing amazing things at Riverside. I used to work there, loved it so much, what they were able to do for students, or at least I used to work at Riverside, not at the ARC. And then San Diego State University has an educational opportunity program, and they have some things listed in their mission statements. So maybe we can practice with this last one. So how do you do these things? Empower students to grow intellectually and personally. Facilitate successful recruitment, retention, and development. Yeah, thank you, Zach. Pre-post assessments, pre-post surveys on awareness of a self-identity. Provide resources and leadership training to empower students. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. These are very big, vague statements, very ambitious, but I agree. Running some focus groups to figure out how to imagine how these things could be done, and imagine what specific and measurable and quantifiable student outcomes would even be. Students can help you imagine, right? We don't have to be in a lab and try to figure it all out on our own. We can definitely go straight to the source and have them help us figure out what success could look like. So the define and plan and collect and report, it's appropriate to include your students and others in every step of that process. You can take measures of independence or self-motivation, like going to office hours or other actions that previous focus groups identified are hard to be motivated to do. Yep, figure out what students are struggling with. And then address those things. Try including students from different levels. The protocol for the FG would have to be precise. For the focus group, would have to be precise and allow them to take the reins. Yes, so I didn't go into too much detail about like how to put questions on your survey and how to create the focus group protocol today. But there's lots of information on how to do those things. But yes, there are definitely times in focus groups where you need to ask very specific questions to get just like kind of a list of information. And then there are times when you need to ask really broad questions and just see what comes out for the students so that you can really get a feel for just, you know, where they're at so that you can meet them where they're at and help them get to where they want to go. And students can also help you in figuring out what those goals are for them and probably should be involved in figuring out what their outcomes would be. Students' participation in clubs, orgs, especially for URM and first gen students. Francisco, I think you are alluding to San Diego State's EOP program. And yes, I hope I'm correct in that assumption, but yes, absolutely. If students are participating in these things, we know from lots and lots of research that if they're doing these things, that there's a lot that they can gain and that students from underrepresented students and first gen students definitely benefit from the social capital that they gain from participating in these things, especially. Yes, that's a very good point. Because we all report to someone else is really also a great idea. Not only ask the students, but to ask your boss, what does success look like, right? And then paint those things for your department. Okay. Anything else? We have about 5 minutes left and I just want to leave time for any questions. I'm gonna skip ahead. I had one more, but I think it was very similar to something. Yeah, we've talked. Yeah, we've done that one already. All right. Any questions? Anything that we want to discuss? Oh, that's a great question. Preferred qualitative text analysis platform. That would be my student staff. I'm kind of kidding. So I typically do my qualitative analysis manually. My team has worked to create kind of a system for how we'll do it when we have open-ended survey data. And as we start to solidify reports, I would be happy to share our method for doing it. I have a student staff team that are amazing with statistics and quantitative data analysis. And they are also very capable of the qualitative data analysis, but I thought that we would benefit from having a system for doing that, so we just created that. There is a program called QDA Minor that I am interested in learning, but I understand that that learning curve is pretty steep. So I'll get around to it, but that's the one that I have my eye on right now. I hope that answers your question. And then I'll also add that this is actually a question that I am actively working on this semester. And I was introduced by Noam in student affairs that there's the D Lab, and they have a lot of resources and information about all of the different platforms, including like in Vivo and I can't remember the other ones off the top of my head, but it also has QDA Minor. There is a version of QDA Minor Lite. Oh, thank you so much, Katie. There is a version of QDA Minor Lite called QDA Minor Lite, which is free. And that's kind of where I'm trying to get started. And then from there, I'm just trying to figure out if it's a good idea for my team to try to learn to use this, considering it's me and students who are gonna be graduating every few years, right? All right, anything else?
All right, Jackie, thank you very, very much. Let's give Jackie a round of applause using our emoticons.
Thank you.
I also want to thank Michelle Rabkin for suggesting this great topic. You don't hear these kind of sessions on subjective outcomes very often, so I appreciate the suggestion. Remember that the slides, the Zoom recording, and the Zoom chat from today will be sent to the CAN listserv. It will also become available on the B Drive. I hope that this session has helped with your professional development and also to feel connected to this community of practice. I also hope that you and your family are safe and well. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.